Originally released in 2020 for PC via Steam, Crypt Stalker is a 2D side-scrolling platforming retro throwback thing that bears the slightest resemblance to the old-school Castlevania games. You fight undead monsters with a whip, you strike down candles for quote-unquote hearts, quote-unquote sub-weapons, and things of that nature. There's a layout similar to those games. And you have levels that play out in a linear progression where you go from point A to point B, where point B is where you fight the boss and beat him, and you get a crystal ball to clear the stage and move on to the next. And there's a bunch of different modes and levels to play, all for a measly couple bucks, which is a pretty sweet deal. Now I heard about this one through YouTube fellow Max Impact 24, Max Impact Gaming, whatever he calls himself these days, and I figured, you know, why not? Let's give it a shot. Looks slightly familiar, right up my alley, that sort of thing. My big takeaway after playing Crypt Stalker was how I wish I had known about this much earlier because I ended up enjoying this much more than I was expecting, and this is a game that only cost a couple bucks at most. And of course it sets off the antivirus, which is rather inconvenient. The devs call it a false positive and they said they'd fix it. This was back in 2020, by the way, so yeet? No yeet? Is that what the kids say now? So I found out there's a Switch version that saw release earlier this year, and coincidentally, I also bought this on an eShop sale for a couple bucks. It normally sells for slightly more than a couple bucks, which I would not recommend, by the way. Wait for a price drop on this one, but at least it won't set off any antivirus program on the Switch. Not yet anyway. But anyways, we're playing the Switch version, and we shall move on from there. So you play the titular Crypt Stalker, aka Gladys, who is stalking these crypts and killing some demons with her whip and her gun. She can strike down candle things for pickups like ammo for your gun, as well as power-ups like a flame whip, as well as different types of bullets for your gun, such as laser bullets and three-way shot bullets. This almost certainly comes across as a classic Vania-style action game, and there's certainly enough influences here and there so that it plays somewhat similarly, but there are key differences, most notably the speed. It's a much faster-paced game, and Gladys herself is quite nimble, so controlling her takes a bit of getting used to, but once you do, it's actually quite nice for the most part. Controls are fairly responsive and stuff like that, no issues there. You have, as mentioned, two main weapons, a whip and a gun. You have a button that lets you swap between the whip and the gun as your main weapon, which is nice because on the one hand, there's no up and attack command to use the gun as a sub-weapon. You could choose it as an active weapon and use it as you would normally use a normal weapon. On the other hand, and I understand they don't do this because it goes against the whole retro feel, but given that retro aesthetic is purely for show anyway, and you have more than one button on the controller, generally speaking, it would have been nice if the gun were its own button instead of swapping between the two weapons, which can be cumbersome at times, but it's a mild quibble to be had on an otherwise fine setup. The game also makes the weird decision to prevent backtracking. You know, like in Super Mario Bros. From 1985. You move to the right and you can't go left, or sometimes it's vice versa, you're moving to the left and you can't go right. There are also vertical segments where you move upwards and the bottom of the screen becomes a perpetual bottomless pit. In true retro style, which is probably where Gladys' speed can become a bit of a detriment because you're moving so fast and you're so into the moment that sometimes you'll miss something that might seem vital, but you can't go back to check it out. Crypt Stalker really does not want you to waste time or loiter. We gotta keep moving onwards. Does the lack of backtracking hurt the game? Not really, it's a design choice and it contributes to the speedy nature of Crypt Stalker, which may or may not be a good thing for some folks who prefer their Vania-inspired stuff to be more methodically paced, as it were. Crypt Stalker boasts a standard campaign of 9 levels, of which the game keeps track of how far you've gone, so you could go back and continue your progress onwards at a later time or replay previous levels, unless you're playing the much easier casual mode, which disables saving altogether. The game does boast additional playing material, such as a quote-unquote lost sequel of about 6 levels or so, an extra quest that gives you a few more levels, about 6 or 7, a challenge mode, a couple boss rushes, and finally there is a handheld mode, a short 4-stage romp that reconceptualizes Crypt Stalker as a portable Game Boy-like title, right down to special borders and greenscale visuals. The sound quality is still a bit on the NES side of things, but the effort is appreciated nonetheless. I like this one quite a bit actually. Granted, I'll take a liking to any game that tries to emulate the old school Vanias while putting their own spin on it if it turns out to be a fun romp, and Crypt Stalker more than satisfies on that count. The faster pace might take a little getting used to at first, but it's part of the thrill. The challenge is firm but fair, and the extra levels certainly have that feel of extra meat for those wanting an even greater challenge. The gameplay hits a bit closer to home with the whip play, which is rather basic and old school, but there is also a hint of the Super Castlevanias in there with the hooks that you can latch onto to swing across pits and stuff. On an 8-bit style game no less. It's not a huge thing, it's only slightly above the bare minimum people are happy with when it comes to this particular style of action game, but I'll take it. In any event, Crypt Stalker is quite the fun little romp, fast-paced, challenging fare, lots of different extra modes and challenges for you to tackle once you've completed the main game, and they made sure to pack as much as possible into one package, so there's always going to be something to do until there eventually isn't. None of that matters though if the gameplay isn't up to snuff, and Crypt Stalker holds up that end of the bargain quite nicely. So as if it isn't plainly obvious, Crypt Stalker is another one of them retro NES style throwback looking and sounding things. Obviously this has more colors and visual effects than what would be possible on the old NES hardware, though I do appreciate the little details like the slight bit of color flicker on the side of the screen. That's a nice touch. The graphics themselves are fine for this style, the scenery is nice and detailed, the character designs are varied and smooth, the overall layout is clean and straightforward, there's nothing in the way of unintentional glitches and things of that nature. The Game Boy look for the handheld mode tries to emulate the dot matrix style, but it's just the regular graphics with a grayscale palette and such, so can't win a ball. But otherwise, as far as this style of visual presentation is concerned, it's not bad. Likewise, Crypt Stalker's sound output is also decidedly family computer-esque, and again, fine job on this front as well. A rather sizable collection of musical tracks can be found here to cover all the different stages, modes, boss fights, and whatnots. They all sound pretty banging, highly energetic, fast-paced, and somewhat moody chiptunes complement the action as you're stalking these crypts. The sound effects are also decidedly crisp and NES sounding, including when you're playing the handheld mode, which is based on a system that sounds slightly different than the old FC. Again, minor gripe on otherwise superb sound design. Overall, Crypt Stalker is a fun, challenging throwback to an earlier time with a slightly modernish twist on things sort of game on Switch. It would have been a fun, challenging throwback to an earlier time with a slightly modernish twist on things sort of game on Steam for only a couple bucks, if not for the antivirus thing, but you could work around that if you want. But beyond that, yeah, Crypt Stalker is quite the romp, packed with stuff to do, gameplay that holds up well, a neatly put together package. For anyone wanting more of a particular style of action platformer, Crypt Stalker may be worth a plunge.